I'm 57 years old. I've worked fishing boats out of Kodiak since I was 19. I know what belongs in a net and what doesn't. On the morning of August 14th, 2008, we pulled something from the water that had no place in any fisherman's catch. We cut her free before sunrise. We didn't speak about it. We didn't report it. We convinced ourselves that releasing her meant it was over. The next morning, when we returned to the boat, there were objects on the deck, one for each of us, placed deliberately, impossible to explain. She had come back in the dark. She knew which boat. She knew how many of us there were. None of us ever told anyone what those objects were. Until now. The alarm goes off at 3:15 a.m. You don't think anymore when you hear it. Your body moves before your brain catches up. Coffee, thermals, boots. The drive to the harbor happens in a kind of autopilot trance. By the time you're on the water, you've been awake for 45 minutes, but you haven't really been conscious yet. That's how it works. You save consciousness for when you need it. We left the dock at 4:10 a.m., four of us on a 36-foot long-line boat. This was mid-August, so we had maybe an hour before real light, the kind of dark where your headlamp just makes everything worse. You learn to work by feel more than sight. The ocean at 4 a.m. is not the same ocean people see from shore during the day. There's no horizon, no separation between water and sky. You exist inside something instead of on top of it. Sound changes, distance changes. Your own hands look unfamiliar in the work lights. We'd been running this same route for 11 days straight. Set nets at dusk, haul them in before dawn, process the catch, sell it, sleep, repeat. Your body falls into the rhythm until you're not making decisions anymore. You're just executing a sequence your muscles remember. The first net came up normal, mostly sockeye, some chum, decent weight. We worked it without talking much. At that hour, you don't waste energy on words. The second net was wrong before we even touched it. You know a net by how it pulls. The weight has a signature. You feel it in the hydraulics, in the way the winch sounds, in the angle of the line where it enters the water. We'd hauled this same setup 200 times. I could tell you what was down there by the resistance alone. This wasn't right. Marcus was running the winch. He slowed it without anyone telling him to. We all felt it at the same time. The net was pulling wrong, not heavier, not lighter. Wrong. Fish move in a net in predictable ways. They thrash, they ball up, they create chaotic drag. Even big bycatch, seals, the occasional dolphin, has a pattern to how it resists. This was different. The net was moving with intention, not panic struggling, something else. "Kill the winch," I said. Marcus stopped it. The net hung there, 20 feet down, just under the surface. We could see the shape of it in the work lights, but not what was inside. "Could be kelp," Danny said. Nobody responded. It wasn't kelp. The boat sat there in the dark, engine idling, net suspended beneath us. You could hear the water against the hull. You could hear all of us breathing. "Bring it up slow," I finally said. The winch engaged again. The net rose 6 inches at a time. The closer it got, the more wrong it felt. I've never been superstitious. I don't believe in omens or bad luck or any of that. But I'm telling you, my body wanted me to cut that net loose and leave it in the water. Something animal in my brain was screaming at me to let it go. We didn't. We kept pulling. The net broke the surface. At first you couldn't see anything clearly, just the silver tangle of mesh and the dark shapes inside. Then the net swung slightly in the lights, and we saw the form. It was tangled near the center, caught in a way that made it obvious this wasn't bycatch sliding through. This was trapped. The mesh had closed around limbs. I'm going to say limbs because I don't have another word. And the more it had moved, the tighter it had gotten. "Stop," I said. Marcus had already stopped. We stood there, 4 men on a boat in the dark, looking at something we didn't have a name for. It wasn't a seal, it wasn't a dolphin, it wasn't a diver, though for a few seconds my brain tried to make it into that because a diver would have made sense. The upper body was humanoid. Shoulders, arms, a torso that moved with breath. The head turned toward us, And that's when the rationalization stopped working. She looked at us, not the blank stare of a fish, not the animal panic of a seal. She looked at each of us, one by one, with full consciousness behind her eyes. I don't know how long we stood there. Time doesn't work right in moments like that. Could have been 10 seconds, could have been 2 minutes. "We have to cut her out," Liam said. His voice sounded strange, flat, like he was forcing himself to talk. Nobody argued. Whatever she was caught, and we were the ones who'd caught her. The net was ours. That made it our responsibility, but none of us moved yet. Because all of us understood, without saying it, that once we touched that net, once we acknowledged what was in it, we'd be stepping over a line we couldn't step back across. Marcus grabbed the gaff first, not to hook her, to pull the net close enough to reach. The mesh dragged across the gunnel, and she came with it, half in the water, half suspended in air. The work lights hit her directly. I'm not going to tell you she looked like a textbook mermaid. She didn't. There was no Disney fairy tale in this. But she wasn't an animal either. The skin was wrong for a marine mammal. Too smooth in places, textured in others, patterned, almost scaled, but not like fish scales, like something between skin and armor. The color shifted depending on the angle of the light. Gray, silver, something close to blue. Her torso had definition, muscle structure, ribs that expanded when she breathed. The arms were longer than human proportions, and the hands, if that's the right word, had webbing between the fingers. But there were fingers, 4 of them fully articulated, with something that could have been nails or claws at the tips. The lower body disappeared into the water, still tangled in the net. I couldn't see clearly what was there, the mesh and the dark water obscured it. But the movement was wrong for legs. Something else was generating thrust, something that flexed and moved as one unit. Her face is what broke me. I've looked into the eyes of a lot of animals, seals, dolphins, even a whale once when we were far enough out. There's intelligence there, awareness. But this was different. She wasn't observing us. She was assessing us. Her eyes tracked our movements. When Marcus stepped left, her gaze followed him. When Danny moved toward the stern, she turned her head to keep him in sight. She was watching us the way you'd watch someone holding a weapon, calculating threat, calculating options. And then she made a sound, not a scream, not a dolphin's clicking. It was vocalized, controlled. It came from her throat, and it had structure to it. Rhythm, like language, but not any language I'd ever heard. "Jesus Christ," Danny whispered. He'd backed up against the opposite rail. She stopped making the sound and looked directly at him. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, they locked eyes. Then she turned her attention back to me. I was the closest. I was holding the knife. I don't know if she understood what the knife was for. I don't know if she understood we were trying to help. But she stopped struggling. She went completely still. She watched me, and she waited. "I'm cutting the net," I said. I don't know why I said it. She wasn't going to understand English, but I said it anyway. I moved slowly. I kept the knife visible. I started cutting the mesh away from her arms first, the places where it had dug in deepest. The net was heavy-gauge nylon. It doesn't cut easy. I had to saw through each section. Every time the blade got close to her, she tracked it with her eyes, but she didn't pull away. Her skin was cold under my hand when I braced against her shoulder to get leverage on the knife. Not fish cold, not mammal warm, something in between. I cut through the section around her left arm. The mesh fell away, and her arm dropped free. She flexed her hand, spreading the fingers, closing them, testing the movement. The webbing between the fingers stretched, translucent in the light. I moved to the other arm. This section was worse. The net had twisted around her wrist and upper arm in a figure 8. I had to cut close to her skin to get it loose. She didn't flinch, not once. She just watched my hands work. When her second arm came free, she reached up and grabbed the edge of the net herself. Not pulling, not fighting, just holding it, steadying it while I cut the lower sections. That's when I knew for certain she understood. She was helping us help her. "Liam, get on this side," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. "We need to support her weight when the last piece gives." Liam moved next to me. He put his hands under her shoulders. She let him. She didn't struggle. She shifted her weight slightly to make it easier. I cut the final section of mesh around her lower body. The net fell away completely. For one moment she was suspended there between us, half supported by our hands, half holding herself up on the gunwale. I saw the full length of her body, no legs. The lower half tapered and split into what I can only describe as a tail, but not like a fish tail. It had a different structure, more muscular. It moved in a way that suggested flexibility and power. Then she pushed off. She didn't drop into the water. She propelled herself backward in one fluid motion, twisting as she went. By the time she hit the surface, she was already gone. The water swallowed her without a splash, without a ripple, like she'd never been there at all. The four of us stood at the rail, staring at the empty black water. The net lay in pieces on the deck. The knife was still in my hand. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then Marcus turned off the work lights, and we motored back to harbor in the dark. They didn't discuss it. That's the detail that matters. Four men standing on a deck in the dark, staring at something that redefined what was possible. And not one of them said, "We should call this in." Not one of them said, "We need to document this." Not one of them reached for the radio. They knew what to do the way you know to pull your hand from fire. It wasn't a decision in the way decisions usually work, weighing options, considering consequences, talking it through. It was older than that, deeper. The kind of knowledge that lives in the body before the mind catches up. Every fishing culture on Earth has a version of the same rule. Some things belong to the ocean, and you don't keep them. The Portuguese call them mal capturas, wrong catches. The Irish say, "Ein me the nachlais duit," animals not meant for you. Japanese fishermen speak of umi no okuri mono, gifts from the sea that must be returned. The language changes, the ocean doesn't. When you catch something that looks back at you with comprehension, with recognition, you put it back. Not because it's humane, because keeping it brings consequences. The superstition isn't specific. It doesn't say, "Don't keep mermaids." It says, "Don't keep what shouldn't be kept." Fishermen across centuries learned this through pattern recognition. Boats that violated the rule reported equipment failure, injuries, disappearances, nets that fouled for no reason, engines that died in calm water, men who went overboard in weather that shouldn't have allowed it. Science calls it coincidence. Fishermen call it debt collection. The men on that boat didn't need to discuss it because their grandfathers had already had the conversation for them. Every story told in harbor bars, every warning passed down, every tale of the boat that kept something it shouldn't have. All of it lived in their bodies that morning as cellular memory. One of them would later describe the feeling as religious, though he wasn't religious. The sense that something larger than him was making the choice through him. Another said he felt his grandfather's hand on his shoulder, though his grandfather had been dead 20 years. A third said only that his body moved before his brain gave permission. They were afraid, but not of her. They were afraid of what keeping her would cost. There's a practical element to this that makes the account credible. These men operate in an economy of silence. Fishing locations are trade secrets. Radio chatter gets monitored by competitors. Calling for help means revealing where you are, what you're doing, what you found. It means inviting authorities into your business. It means answering questions you don't want asked. But that's not why they didn't call. They didn't call because somewhere in their bones they understood. No authority handles this. No government agency has jurisdiction over what lives in the unmapped deep. No protocol exists for catching something that shouldn't exist. The choice wasn't between keeping her and calling for help. The choice was between releasing her and claiming her. And claiming her felt like theft. Not theft from the ocean, theft from something older, something that predates human law. The kind of theft that doesn't get prosecuted in court but gets answered in other ways. One of the men was Catholic, raised by a mother who prayed to St. Anthony for protection at sea, who kept a small statue of Mary in the wheelhouse, who crossed herself every time the boat left harbor. He said later that in the moment they found her, he heard his mother's voice in his head, repeating something she used to say, "Some things are God's to keep, not yours." He didn't pray, he didn't cross himself, but he felt the weight of that teaching moving his hands as they reached for the knife. Another man wasn't religious at all, hadn't been inside a church since childhood, but he grew up hearing stories from his uncle, a fisherman who worked the North Atlantic in the 1970s. The uncle told a story once about a boat that caught something, he never said what, and kept it. Brought it to port in a covered container, sold it to someone, made a lot of money. 3 weeks later, the boat sank. Engine fire, cause unknown. 2 men died. The uncle told that story as a warning, not a ghost story. You don't keep what the ocean trusts you to see. That memory came back to the man on the deck that morning with the force of physical law. The ocean had trusted them with something impossible. The only acceptable response was to give it back. The timing mattered too. They found her in the pre-dawn dark, that strange hour when the mind operates differently, when rational thought hasn't fully reasserted itself after sleep. The hour when fishermen see things, shapes in the water, lights below the surface, movement that doesn't match known animals, and don't question what they're seeing because the rational filter isn't online yet. If they'd caught her at noon, in full sun, with the harbor visible on the horizon, the encounter might have gone differently. Daylight clarifies. Daylight rationalizes. Daylight makes you think you can handle what darkness knows you cannot. But they found her at 4 a.m., in the liminal space between night and dawn, in the hour when the old rules still apply. And in that hour, they listened to ancestors they'd never met. They didn't discuss whether she was real. They didn't theorize about what she was. They didn't stand in a circle and debate marine biology or evolutionary possibility. They moved as one body with one purpose: undo the net, give her back, restore the order they'd disrupted. One of them would say later, "It felt like correcting a mistake the universe had made by putting her in our path, like we were supposed to erase it." Another said, "I knew if we kept her, we'd all die. I didn't know how. I didn't know when, but I knew." The certainty wasn't logical. It was older than logic. They weren't saving her. They were saving themselves. The first cut into the net felt like sacrilege. Nets cost money. Repairs cost time. Every commercial fisherman knows the value of the web that feeds him, knows the hours spent mending, the careful maintenance that keeps a net functional across years of use. But the knife went in without hesitation. One man held the light. Another steadied the section of net. A third cut. The fourth stood watch, though for what, he couldn't have said. The movement was coordinated, urgent, and silent. They worked the way men work in crisis. No wasted motion, no discussion. The net was tangled around her in multiple places, across her torso, around one arm, caught in what they would later struggle to describe, the place where her body changed, where human anatomy gave way to something else. They didn't untangle her. They cut her free. Untangling would have required time, required touching her, required close examination of how the mesh had wrapped her. Cutting was faster. Cutting maintained distance. Cutting meant they could release her and step back before their minds caught up to what their hands were doing. The knife was serrated, designed for cutting line under tension. It went through the net webbing in seconds. She didn't fight them. That's what they remembered, most clearly. She didn't thrash or pull away. She floated in the section of net they'd dragged over the gunwale, watching them work, her eyes tracking each movement. One of them saw her hand move, just once. A slow, deliberate motion that brought her fingers to the section of net, still tangled across, her chest, as if she was trying to help, or as if she understood what they were doing. They didn't speak to her. What would they have said? But one man made eye contact, held it for longer than comfortable. Later, he would describe the sensation as being seen, not just looked at, but recognized as an individual, as a conscious being, making a choice that she understood. He said it felt like she was asking a question. He said he tried to answer with his eyes. "We're putting you back." Whether she understood, he never knew. The final cut severed the last section of mesh holding her. The net fell away. For a moment she floated free in the open air, suspended in the work lights over the dark water, and 4 men held their breath as the impossible hung between worlds. Then she moved. Not a fall, not a dive. A deliberate descent, controlled and fluid, her body twisting in a way that shouldn't have been anatomically possible, her form slipping from the rail into the black water below with barely a splash. She didn't surface. The men stood at the rail, holding the ruined net, waiting for her to reappear. They stared at the water where she'd entered, at the faint ripple already smoothing out, at the darkness that had swallowed her as completely as if she'd never existed. One of them started counting seconds in his head. 30, 40, 60. She didn't come up. Normal human physiology allows for breath holding of 1 to 2 minutes in untrained individuals, longer for free divers. They waited past 2 minutes, past 3. The water remained still. She was gone. One man crossed himself. Another let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. A third turned away from the rail and walked back to the wheelhouse without speaking. The fourth stayed at the rail longer, watching the empty water, thinking about how she'd moved when she entered it. How natural it looked. How much it resembled coming home. They didn't speak as they hauled in the rest of the net, slow, mechanical, trying to return to routine. Didn't speak as they coiled the damaged section and set it aside for repair. Didn't speak as the captain started the engine and turned the boat toward harbor. The sky was lightening, not dawn yet, but close, the darkness thinning to gray. One man looked back at the water one last time, saw nothing. The ocean looked like every other morning, vast, indifferent, holding its secrets under a surface that revealed nothing. They motored back in silence, each man alone with the knowledge of what he'd just done. Release felt like the right word at the time, but later, in retrospect, one of them would say it felt more like permission, as if they'd been caught in a test they didn't know they were taking, and the only way to pass was to give back what was never meant to be theirs. Another would say it felt like an exchange, not a gift, not mercy, but a transaction governed by rules older than human law. You are shown something impossible. You prove you can be trusted with it. You let it return to the deep. None of them said it felt finished. Even as they tied up at the dock, as they unloaded the catch and hosed down the deck, as they went through the mechanical routines of ending a shift, something unresolved hung over the boat. One man paused at the rail before leaving, his hand on the cold metal, looking down at the deck where the net had lain. Where she had been. The space was empty now, clean. Nothing remained to prove what had happened except the damaged net and the memory locked in 4 minds. He turned away and walked down the dock toward his truck. Behind him, the boat sat silent in the early morning light, rocking gently in the harbor swell. None of them thought to check the deck that night. They were too exhausted, too desperate to go home, to step away from the boat, to put walls and distance between themselves and the impossible thing they'd witnessed. They locked up and left. If they'd stayed, if they'd checked the deck one more time before leaving, they would have seen what was waiting. But they didn't stay. And by the time they returned the next morning, she'd already been back. They motored back to harbor as the sun broke the horizon. The work lights went dark. The ocean turned from black to gray to blue, and with the light came the unspoken agreement. They would not talk about what had happened, not to the harbor master, not to their families, not to each other. They didn't gather on deck to discuss it. No one suggested a meeting, a plan, a story to coordinate. They simply understood. The thing they had pulled from the net and cut free in the darkness before dawn, that stayed out there. It didn't come back with them. It didn't exist in daylight. The youngest deckhand hosed down the deck. The captain logged the catch as normal. They tied off at the dock and unloaded in silence, moving through the routine with mechanical precision. Ice, scales, weight, invoice. The morning proceeded as every morning had proceeded for years. One by one they went home. Each man carried the same desperate need to reintegrate into normal reality, to let the familiar landscape of their lives overwrite what they had seen. Breakfast, shower, television, the small domestic rhythms that prove the world is ordinary. The captain sat at his kitchen table and drank coffee. His wife asked how the haul went. He said fine. She asked if he was feeling all right. He said tired. She accepted this. Fishermen were always tired. The deckhand who had held the knife stood under the shower for 40 minutes, hot water running, until it went cold. He told himself it had been a seal, a disoriented diver, a woman in a costume doing something incomprehensible for reasons he couldn't guess. He didn't believe any of these explanations, but he stacked them in his mind anyway, building a wall between himself and what he knew he had seen. The oldest crew member, the one who had met her eyes when they first pulled the net close, went to bed at 10 in the morning. He drew the curtains. He didn't sleep. He lay in darkness and tried to remember if he had touched her. He couldn't be certain. The net had been tangled. His hands had been working to free the lines. He might have brushed against her skin, her arm, her shoulder. He wasn't sure. The not knowing disturbed him more than the memory of her face. By midday, each man had begun the work of bearing the experience, not forgetting, that was impossible, but sealing it away in some mental compartment where it couldn't contaminate the rest of their lives. They had jobs to return to, rent to pay, families who depended on their capacity to function normally. They couldn't afford to be the men who claimed they'd pulled something impossible from the ocean. The isolation helped. Fishermen worked alone or in small crews, often for days at a stretch. They were used to carrying things privately. The ocean taught you that. You saw things out there, strange lights, shapes in the water, sounds that didn't match any animal you knew. And you learned not to speak about them, not because you didn't trust your own senses, but because you understood that some experiences didn't translate to shore. The people who lived on land operated by different rules. They hadn't earned the right to hear certain things, so the crew kept quiet. By evening, each man had almost convinced himself that the strangeness was over, that the encounter had been contained to those hours before dawn, and that returning her to the water had severed any connection between them. They had held up their end. They hadn't kept her, hadn't called authorities, hadn't taken photographs, or tried to prove anything. They had done what instinct and something older than instinct had told them to do. They had let her go. The ocean had its mysteries. This had been one of them. Now it was finished. The captain fell asleep in his chair watching the evening news. The deckhand ate dinner with his girlfriend and didn't mention that his hands were still shaking. The oldest crew member finally slept just after sunset, his dreamless exhaustion deeper than any rest he'd had in years. Each man believed, as he closed his eyes that night, that when he woke the next morning, the world would have returned to its proper order. The encounter would begin its slow transformation into something dreamlike, its edges softening with distance, until he could almost believe it hadn't happened at all. They were wrong. She hadn't disappeared into the depths. She hadn't forgotten them, and the pact they thought they'd made, release for silence, freedom for forgetting, had never been agreed to. Daylight had restored nothing. The natural order had not returned, and when the sun rose again, each man would learn that cutting her free had not been the end of anything. It had been the beginning. The captain arrived at the boat first, just after 5 in the morning. He liked to check the deck before the rest of the crew showed up, walk the perimeter, inspect the lines. Old habit. He'd been doing it for 30 years. He saw the object before he'd even stepped fully aboard. It sat in the center of the deck, placed with deliberate care, not tossed, not dropped. Positioned exactly where someone would find it immediately upon boarding. He stopped moving. His hand was still on the rail. For several seconds, he didn't breathe. The thing was smooth, pale, shaped like no shell he'd ever seen, and no stone the ocean had any right to produce. It caught the early light in a way that made his eyes hurt. He didn't touch it. Not yet. He walked around it slowly, the way you'd circle something dead that might not be dead. His mind was working hard to fit this object into a category that made sense. Driftwood, carved bone, trash washed up from another boat. None of those explanations held. This was too deliberate, too specific, too clean. The deckhand arrived 20 minutes later. He climbed aboard and froze exactly as the captain had. "You saw it," the deckhand said, not a question. "I saw it. There's one in front of the hold, too." The captain turned. The deckhand was right. A second object, identical to the first, rested near the forward hatch. He hadn't noticed it. He'd been too focused on the one in the center. They found the third object near the port side rail, then a fourth near the stern. By the time the rest of the crew arrived, they'd counted 5 in total, one for each man who had been on deck the night they pulled her from the net. No one spoke for a long time. They stood in a loose circle, each staring at the object nearest to them, and the silence carried a weight that words couldn't. The oldest crew member finally crouched and picked his up. His hands were steady. He turned it over slowly, examining it from every angle. "She came back," he said. "Don't," the deckhand said. His voice was sharp. "Don't say that." "She came back," the old man repeated. "She found this boat. She climbed aboard. She left these, one for each of us." "It could have been anyone," the deckhand said. "Someone playing a prank. Someone who saw us that morning and—" "No one saw us that morning." "Then someone heard. Someone on another boat. Someone—" "No one heard." The captain's voice was flat, final. "And no one else was on this boat last night. I checked the lock. No one forced it. No one came through the cabin. These were placed here by someone who came from the water." The deckhand's face went pale. He looked at the object near his feet but didn't pick it up. The youngest crew member, the one who had tied off the net that night, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Why?" It was the question all of them had been thinking. Why come back? Why leave these? What did she want? The objects themselves offered no answers. They were smooth and cool to the touch, lighter than they should have been for their size, and marked with patterns that could have been natural or could have been carved. Each one was identical except for minor variations, small enough that you'd need to compare them side by side to notice. The captain examined his more closely. The surface had ridges that ran in spirals, too precise to be random. When he held it up to the light, it seemed to glow faintly from within, though that might have been a trick of the early sun. "What are they made of?" the deckhand asked. "I don't know." "Are they shells?" "I don't think so." "Bone?" "Maybe." The oldest crew member set his down carefully on the deck, as if it might shatter. He looked at the captain. "She didn't forget us." "No. She knows who we are." "Yes?" "She knows where we dock." "Yes." The deckhand made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something breaking. He sat down hard on the deck, his back against the rail. "This is insane," he said. "This is completely insane." "You want to call someone?" the captain asked. His voice was calm, too calm. "Call who?" "Police, Coast Guard, marine biologist, anyone you think would believe us." The deckhand didn't answer. They all knew the answer. No one would believe them. And even if someone did, even if they managed to convince an authority to take them seriously, what then? What would they say? "We caught something 2 nights ago and released it, and now it's leaving us gifts?" The word gifts settled uneasily in the captain's mind. That's what these were, weren't they? Tokens, offerings, payment for the favor of cutting her free. but the weight of them felt wrong. Gratitude didn't explain the dread he felt looking at them. Gratitude didn't explain why she'd come back in darkness, undetected, and left these objects in the exact spots where each man would find them. This wasn't a thank you. This was a message. You saw me. I see you. We are connected now. The sun was fully up. The harbor was waking. Other boats were preparing to head out. The crew stood on the deck, surrounded by objects that shouldn't exist, and understood with absolute certainty that nothing had ended when they cut her free. She had returned. She knew them, and the objects in their hands were proof that she intended for them to remember. The captain slipped his into his jacket pocket. One by one, the others did the same. They didn't discuss it. They didn't need to. Each man understood that discarding the objects would be worse than keeping them. Whether out of superstition or fear or some instinct they couldn't name, they all knew. You don't throw away what she gave you. They went to work. They hauled nets. They processed the catch. They moved through the day as if nothing had changed. But each man carried the weight of what was in his pocket, smooth and cool and impossibly real, and knew that he would carry it for the rest of his life. I don't know what she left us, not in any scientific sense. I can describe what it looked like, what it felt like when I touched it, how it changed over the years. But I cannot tell you what it was made of, or where it came from, or what it meant. None of us could. There were 5 of us on deck that morning when we pulled her from the net. The next day, there were 5 objects waiting, 1 for each man. Mine was the size of a sand dollar, roughly circular, flat on one side and slightly domed on the other. It looked like shell material at first, that pale, translucent quality you get with abalone or mother of pearl. But the surface had a texture I'd never seen on any shell. Fine ridges spiraled from the center outward in a pattern too precise to be natural growth, too deliberate. I picked it up. It was lighter than shell, slightly warm, and when I held it to the light, I could see layers inside it, thin as paper, stacked in some kind of internal structure that made no sense. It didn't feel like a shell. It felt like something grown for a purpose. The others found theirs in different locations on the boat. Diego's was near the portside winch. Marcus found his on the bait freezer lid. Carl's was sitting on the helm console, directly in front of the wheel. Mine was on the deck where I'd been standing when we cut the net. She had placed them deliberately. She knew where each of us had been. Carl's object was different from mine, darker, more stone-like, heavier. He said it had holes through it, 5 of them, precisely spaced, smooth-edged. He couldn't figure out if they were functional or decorative. It looked carved, he said, but there were no tool marks. Marcus never described his in detail. He was the youngest on the crew, barely 20, and he wouldn't talk about what he found. He kept it, though. I know because years later, his widow mentioned it after the funeral. She said he'd kept it in a wooden box in his workshop and told her never to open it. She honored that. I don't know if she ever looked. Diego's was organic. He told me once, years afterward, when we were the only 2 still alive, that his object smelled like the ocean, but never dried out. It stayed slightly damp to the touch no matter how long he kept it in open air. He described it as a piece of woven material, like kelp, braided into a cord, but when he tried to unravel it to see how it was made, it wouldn't come apart. The structure held. None of us had it tested, not by a university, not by a marine biologist, not by anyone. To do that, we would have had to explain where it came from. We would have had to tell the story. And none of us were ready for what that would cost. There's a pattern in the old stories. The ones fishermen tell in harbor bars after the 3rd drink, when the conversation drifts into the strange. When something from the deep makes contact, it leaves a marker, a gift, a token, call it what you want. The stories come from Iceland, from Japan, from Polynesia, from the North Sea. Different oceans, same structure. The gift is proof. It says, this happened, you did not imagine it, I was real. But the gift is also a test. What you do with it matters. Some accounts describe fishermen who tried to sell the objects to collectors, to researchers, to museums. In those stories, the objects disappear, stolen, lost, crumbled to dust overnight. One account from Norway describes a fisherman who tried to take his token to a university in Oslo. He made it halfway there before his boat sank in calm water with no explanation. He survived. The object did not. Other stories describe men who returned the gifts to the ocean, believing that was the correct response. Some of those men report relief, as though a burden was lifted. Others say they felt watched afterward, followed, that the presence never left. And then there are the men who kept the objects and stayed silent. That's what we did. I kept mine in a leather pouch in the back of my closet for 37 years. I checked on it maybe twice a year, always alone, always at night. Every time I opened that pouch, I expected it to have dissolved or rotted or vanished. It never did, but it changed. The spiral ridges became more pronounced. The translucency deepened. By the 10th year, I could see something moving inside it when I held it up to light. Not liquid, not gas, something else. A shimmer, a slow pulse. I do not know if that was decay or growth. I do not know if it was reacting to being out of the ocean or if it was designed to change over time. I only know that it was not inert. Carl once told me his object got heavier, not much, just a few grams over the years, but enough that he noticed when he held it. He weighed it on a postal scale, documented it. Then he stopped because the implications terrified him. Diego said his object began to smell different after 20 years. Not rot, not decay, just different, more complex, like it was aging the way wood ages, developing character, deepening. These were not souvenirs. They were not inert fragments washed up from the sea. They were something closer to living things, or things that had been alive, or things that existed in a category we don't have language for, and we kept them anyway, because throwing them away felt like a betrayal, because we feared what she would do if we discarded her gifts, because they were the only evidence we had that it was real, that we weren't all sharing the same hallucination, that the world contained something our science couldn't explain. The objects outlasted our silence. They stayed intact while our memories blurred, while we doubted ourselves, while the story became something we could almost dismiss as a collective delusion if we tried hard enough. But the objects didn't let us forget. I still have mine. It's in my jacket pocket right now. I've carried it with me for the past 6 months since the diagnosis. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it when I die. I don't know if my daughter will throw it away, keep it, bury it with me. I don't know if it matters. What I do know is this: she gave us something we couldn't explain, and in doing so, she marked us. She made us carriers of proof. And whether we wanted that responsibility or not, we accepted it the moment we picked those objects up off the deck. We became witnesses. And the objects became our burden. We never spoke about it, not publicly, not for decades. That requires explanation because it's the part people don't understand when they hear a story like this. They ask, why didn't you report it? Why didn't you go to the authorities, the news, the scientists? The answer is simple. We wanted to keep working. A fisherman who reports something strange becomes a fisherman nobody hires. That's not cruelty, it's economics. Boats operate on reputation. Crews are built on trust. You need men who show up sober, work hard, follow orders, and don't create problems. A deckhand known for telling wild stories becomes a problem. The ocean makes people superstitious, always has. We operate in an environment we can't control, doing work that kills people regularly, surrounded by forces we don't understand. Rituals develop, beliefs take root. Some fishermen won't leave port on Fridays, others won't allow women on the boat, or bananas, or won't whistle while working. It sounds irrational from shore, but at sea those beliefs are survival mechanisms. They impose order on chaos. But there's a line. You can believe privately, follow your rituals quietly, and still be considered professional. Cross that line. Start talking about things you saw, creatures you encountered, experiences that can't be verified, and you become the kind of fisherman other fishermen avoid. We all knew men like that. The guy at the harbor bar who tells the same story about the thing he saw off the Farallones in 1978 and how everyone smiles politely and stops listening. The deckhand who got a reputation for seeing things and couldn't get work anymore ended up on disability drinking alone. We knew what happened to witnesses. We'd watched it happen. So we made a pact. It wasn't formal. Nobody shook hands or signed anything. But within hours of finding the objects, it was understood. We don't talk about this. Not to family. Not to other crews. Not to anyone. What happened on the boat stays on the boat. That pact held for 37 years. It held through marriages. Carl's wife knew something had happened. He told me that much. But he never gave her details. She knew he kept something locked in his garage workbench, something he wouldn't explain. She respected that. Or maybe she didn't want to know. Diego was the only one of us who was single when it happened. He stayed that way. I don't know if the two things were connected, but I always wondered. He lived alone, worked alone when he could, didn't socialize much after that season. The object he kept, the woven one that never dried, he stored it in his truck. Told me once he didn't like having it in his house. Didn't say why. Marcus had a young family, 2 kids under 5 when it happened, a third on the way. He needed steady work. He couldn't afford to be the guy with the crazy story. So he buried it. He must have, because in 20 years of working the same docks, I never once heard him mention that morning to anyone, not even to me, and I was standing right next to him when it happened. The youngest deckhand, the one who found his object last, left fishing entirely within a year. He told people he wanted to go back to school, get certified in welding, work on land. Maybe that was true. Or maybe he couldn't stand being on the water anymore, couldn't stop thinking about what might be watching from below. I lost track of him after he moved inland. For the rest of us, silence became routine. We went back to work. We ran the same routes, pulled the same nets, worked the same grounds. The ocean didn't change. We did. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way the water moved at night when there was no wind. Shapes in the distance that might have been debris or seals or something else. Sounds that didn't match any animal I knew. I never saw her again, but I started wondering how many times she'd been close without me knowing. The object in my closet became a kind of anchor on nights when I questioned whether it had really happened, whether we'd all hallucinated, whether exhaustion and darkness had created something out of nothing. I could take it out and hold it. It was real, solid, proof, but proof I could never show anyone. Carl and I talked about it occasionally over the years, not often, maybe once every few years, late at night, after we'd had enough whiskey to loosen the fear. He struggled with it more than I did. He was religious, Catholic, went to Mass most Sundays, and he couldn't reconcile what we'd seen with what he'd been taught. He asked his priest about it once, hypothetically, described it as a dream. The priest told him that God's creation contained mysteries, and that some things were not meant to be understood by men. That didn't help him. Diego kept working into his 60s. His hands got too stiff for the nets eventually, and he retired to a small place inland, up near the foothills. I visited him there twice before he died. The second time, we finally talked about it directly. He told me he didn't regret keeping silent, but he wished he understood what she'd wanted from us. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. The pact started breaking down when Carl died. Heart attack. Sudden, at 68. At his funeral, his son approached me and asked if I knew what his father had kept in the garage. He'd found it while cleaning out the workshop, the stone object with the precise holes. He wanted to know what it was. I told him it was a keepsake from a fishing trip, something his father found meaningful. I told him to keep it safe. He looked at me like he knew I wasn't telling him everything, but he didn't push, and I didn't offer. Marcus died 3 years later, lung cancer. His widow mentioned the box in his workshop after the service. She said she'd honored his wishes and never opened it, but now that he was gone, she didn't know what to do with it. I told her to bury it with him. She did. Diego passed last year, pneumonia. I was the only one from the old crew still alive by then. I drove up for the funeral. Afterward, I checked his truck, the one he'd kept the object in. It was gone. I don't know if he disposed of it before he died, or if someone took it, or if it vanished the way the old stories say they sometimes do. His truck was unlocked. The glove box was open. There was nothing inside. That left me, the last one, the last witness who could tell the story firsthand. And that's when the weight became unbearable. As long as there were others who knew, I wasn't alone with it. The silence was shared. The burden was distributed. But when Diego died, it all fell on me. I'm 71 now. I have maybe a year left, maybe less. The cancer's in my liver and lungs. They can't operate. I declined the treatments that might have bought me a few extra months. I've made my peace with dying. But I can't die with this story locked inside me. That's why I'm speaking now, not because I want to be believed, not because I need validation, but because this story deserves to exist outside my memory, because she was real, and what she did mattered, and the silence we kept for 37 years protected us but also erased her. I owe her more than that, so I'm breaking the pact. I'm the only one left who can, and I'm telling you now. We pulled her from the net, we let her go, and she came back. She left us proof, she left us marked, and the ocean has been watching us ever since. He's dying. That's the simple part. Lung cancer, stage 4, maybe 6 months if the treatment works. He told his daughter first, then his priest. Then, for reasons he still can't fully explain, he told me, not about the cancer, about what happened in 1987, about what he's kept in a lockbox for 36 years. 2 of the other men are already gone. Heart attack took one in 2003. Stroke got another in 2019. The 4th won't return calls anymore. He said the silence was always meant to be permanent, that breaking it would be the same as throwing the object back into the sea, a violation of something agreed upon without words. But the weight became unbearable. He said it wasn't guilt exactly, it was the solitude of knowing, the isolation of carrying proof that the world is not what we're told it is, and having no one to share that knowledge with who wouldn't think him insane or broken. His hands shook when he showed me the object. I won't describe it here. That's his choice to make if he ever goes further than this. But I'll say this, it exists, it's real, and there is no category for it in any reference material I've consulted. He wanted me to know before he dies. He said the story can't disappear with him. Someone else has to carry it. 80% of the ocean remains unexplored. We've mapped the surface of Mars in more detail than our own seafloor. The deep is not empty. It's simply unobserved. This account follows a pattern documented across centuries and coastlines. Fishermen in Polynesia, divers off the Hebrides, trawler crews in the North Atlantic. The details shift, but the structure holds. Encounter in darkness, release or escape, object left behind. These witnesses had no contact with one another. Many never spoke publicly. Some took the story to their graves. The consistency suggests something. Either we're looking at an archetypal psychological response to isolation and the ocean's vastness, or we're looking at recurring contact with something that has learned how to remain hidden, something that understands gift exchange, something intelligent enough to track a specific boat in darkness and leave objects for specific men. Science offers explanations: oxygen deprivation, decompression effects, pattern recognition errors in low light. These account for sightings. They don't account for physical objects appearing on a deck where nothing was left the night before. The men who stay silent the longest are often the most credible when they finally speak. They resisted attention. They had no incentive to fabricate. They tried to forget. The ones who come forward decades later, often near death, carry a testimonial weight that attention seekers never achieve. If she was real, If intelligence exists in the deep that chooses not to surface, what does that mean? It means the ocean has been watching us as long as we've watched it. It means contact has happened before and will happen again. It means there are others carrying similar secrets, objects locked away, stories they'll never tell. The world is stranger than we admit, and the ocean keeps what it wants to keep. The objects were never tested. Her nature was never explained. The ocean keeps what belongs to it, including answers. 80% of the deep remains unmapped. The witnesses with the most credible accounts often stay silent the longest. Perhaps the deep has always been watching back, revealing itself only to those who prove they'll return what doesn't belong to them. The men made a choice in the dark. She responded at dawn. What that exchange meant, none of them will ever fully understand.